Hi, so I'm Jenna, and I'm a fourth-year architecture student. I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and then I came to the University of Idaho to be on the women's golf team and participate in the architecture program. So, as part of Andrea's studio, we kind of did a deep dive into fire lookouts. And so my project is called the 5S Organization System, so an architectural investigation into the operation and design of Idaho fire lookouts with an emphasis on sanitation. So in the studio, we split the project kind of into three phases. So typological investigation, intervention, and prototyping. So you can kind of think of this as like research and then like subtle design changes and then sort of like reinventing the wheel. So how can you redesign the fire lookout, how it looks, how it functions for the future. So in that first phase, again, it's sort of like a broad overview. And so I come from Alberta where there are fire lookouts, and I was familiar, but not to the extent that you folks are. And so this was sort of like a broad study into, okay, how do lookouts work with each other and like the pinpoints. And so I selected this cluster, and it's called the Isabella Landing cluster, and it's along the Little North Fork River. And so it was sort of important to understand, okay, like what is operational and then what is no longer there. So the two blue pinpoints are fire lookouts that are still standing and operational today. And then the red are ones that were there at one point, but are no longer there. And just, the evidence of the concrete footings, that's how people obviously understood that they were there. And then I sort of wanted to establish a timeline, which you can see along the bottom. So what iteration of tower, in what time period, how long did these things last? And then maybe, start to conceive why did certain towers fade out at certain times? So was it World War II? Was it the view shed? And that's sort of what this main kind of mapping aspect is. So what can you actually see from each tower elevation? And then this bottom right image is what can all of these towers see together? And so that just sort of helped me understand kind of the elevations and the angles and where they were positioned on the ridge. And so then kind of another big aspect of this overall research was the trails and connections. So how are people getting from like the main highway road up to the lookouts? And, for me, again, with my background knowledge, I didn't necessarily understand that in a lot of cases you're having to hike quite a distance. And so when you're coming at this from like a construction perspective, the fact that you're off grid and you're having to carry the equipment and carry the supplies like over the course of a season or to preserve or to reconstruct, that was sort of a really important thing to understand for this project. And then what I ended up doing was selecting a site and a lookout to work on. So this is Goat Grassy Point Fire Lookout. It's at an elevation of about 6,000 feet. And it was a 1940s cupola cabin. It's obviously not standing today, but I found like one black and white photo that kind of helped me create this floor plan and section and vision for what this lookout might have looked like. Kind of what drew me to this was the fact that like the podium it's sitting on is a boulder. And I think my idea of the fire lookout, it's on the big tower. And so the fact that the land made the tower was super interesting to me. And then also there's just a lot of opportunities here because, when you're looking at like this, there's safety concerns. Can an animal climb the tower? And then structurally, like it's sort of teetering on the edge of this boulder. Like, is that actually safe? And then even like from the sanitation perspective, like obviously like this was like a very early lookout. And so you don't have very much inside and you don't have much from like a bathroom, maybe a pit toilet in the forest. And so it was sort of this thread of sanitation that I grabbed onto as I entered like the next phase of the project. So this is the intervention. So this is sort of where you're making like subtle adjustments, but it was really important to me to maintain like the traditional experience. And so it wasn't at this phase about reinventing the wheel, but more so about seeking to like understand and then how can you populate the lookout and make subtle adjustments. And so this was a diagram that I created. And I went through a bunch of manuals and a bunch of personal stories and tried to figure out, okay, like what equipment do you actually need, especially like from a modern point of view. So a lot of, and I know that the text is really small, but a lot of the information and the items on the right are actually from like Amazon. So things today that you could buy in an affordable way that would help sort of modernize the lookout experience. And then my kind of big taking like all of this information to like begin to intervene. because you can see the original cabin, but now I've added this element of the elevated pit toilet. So sort of, taking the traditional pit toilet concept, bringing it on grade with the cabin, making it accessible at the end of the season so that you can clean it out. But then you don't have your lookout going into the forest in the middle of the night. And then sort of safety updates and structural updates. And so even having the electric fence, but the solar powered electric fence. So thinking of sustainability, and then just sort of populating it with these sort of basic items that make life easier, and rainwater harvesting, and those were all things I started to sort of experiment with. And then this was a rendering I did based on that design. So if you can kind of imagine life inside the lookout, I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with that, but it was just really important for me to sort of maintain the traditional sense, not to have some sort of 5-star resort on top of the mountain. And I think the rustic experience, there's something really special about that, but then also accepting that there is modern technologies that can help make that experience better. And so then moving into the final phase, this was the prototyping, and this is where I sort of discovered this 5S organization method. And so this is sort of my new vision for the fire lookout. And what this came from was this Japanese workplace organization method that I found, because as much as it's a home and as much as you're living there, it's a workplace. And so the 5S organization method is shine, sort, set in order, standardize, and sustain. And so how can you redesign a fire lookout with these principles? So, in the beginning, the pit toilet's in the forest, and then in the second iteration, it's on grade. And now that pit toilet is actually the core, structurally, figuratively, metaphorically, of the design, and still accessible for cleaning at the end of the season. And then all kind of those yellow areas that you can see highlighted are sort of design interventions. So floor storage. So being able to maximize your square footage. And then storage cubbies, the stairs to the cupola that fold in and out. And so even in this sort of shows it better. There's sort of this expanded form and this retracted form, because when you're closing up at the end of each season, you want to make sure, right, that the pests and the animals don't get in. And so this really heightened focus on organization. There's almost this spaceship sort of quality, and I actually looked at spaceship and rocket design as sort of precedent studies for this. And you have the firefinder that can maintain its central position but sink into the floor, the bed pieces that fold in and out, desks that drop down. And so it's kind of the balance of workplace and home, and then integrating sort of the environmental system, so solar powered electric fence and the rainwater harvesting. And then at least structurally, because I had been sort of studying this Japanese workplace method, I was inspired by Japanese tea house design, and then also bamboo and Indonesian huts. And so that sort of helped kind of create almost this pagoda style fire lookout. But what was sort of interesting about the materiality, right? Bamboo is unique and probably not necessarily thought of for a fire lookout, but there's great opportunities with joints and on-site building, where if you can get the materials up there, it's actually there's lots of unique joint types that you can use that might make building an off-grid a little bit easier. So yeah, that's sort of my kind of learning process of fire lookouts, and then my research, and then sort of my design and hopes for the future. So thank you very much.
Wow.